Hey guys, tonight we slip through the creaking gates of the Middle Ages, where the moon glows pale on iron helmets and banners flap against stone battlements. The air smells of smoke, wet hay, and someone's dinner that's probably just barley stew again. You might be imagining knights marching around like polished action figures, armor glistening in candlelight, swords catching every sparkle like a Renaissance fair catalog cover. But brace yourself, if you stepped into an actual medieval joust. You'd discover armor was less shimmering Instagram filter and more muddy car after a long road trip. And yes, you probably wouldn't survive the smell, so before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to drop your location and local time down in the comments, so I can picture where you're listening in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey. Together, you trudge up to the tilt yard, where knights prepare for a tournament. In your imagination, they all look like shiny chess pieces, dazzling in silver and gold. But the myth of knights as flawless metallic mannequins is just that, a myth. Armor, in reality, was a patchwork of dents, scrapes, and quick patch jobs, looking more like a used car lot than a luxury showroom. After all, if you're being whacked by swords and lances, your wardrobe suffers. Imagine showing up to prom in a suit of tin that already looks like it survived 3 paintball wars. That's basically the vibe. The truth is, armor was functional above all else. Instead of always gleaming, much of it bore the scars of battle. Knights used sand, vinegar, and even urine, yes, urine, to scrub off rust. And polishing wasn't done daily, it was exhausting work. That shiny suit you're picturing, more likely a rare display armor locked away for ceremonies, not for the mud-splattered grind of combat. Let's bring in the proof. Historically, we know from inventories that nobles owned multiple suits of armor, one for training, one for battle, and one just for looking fancy at parades. One famous suit in the royal armories shows polished breastplates layered over bits of armor, so banged up it looked like it had hosted a medieval demolition derby. On the quirky side, a knight might paint his armor with oil or even animal fat to keep rust away, so yes, sometimes they smelled faintly of bacon before going into combat. And historians still argue whether the famous tournament armor was ever truly practical, or if it was more like wearing a tuxedo that doubled as a personal oven. Here's where it gets funny. Picture a knight taking 20 minutes just to strap into his plate, only to sneeze halfway through polishing and splash vinegar on his squire. Or imagine your friend insisting on armor cosplay at Comic-Con, but midway through the day, they start squeaking like a shopping cart because they forgot to oil the joints. Armor had its elegance, sure, but it also had squeaks, groans, and the occasional wardrobe malfunction. The myth of shiny knights sticks around because our brains love the fairy tale image. But the reality is grubbier, more human. A knight in full battle gear was closer to a hot, sweaty endurance athlete than a fantasy magazine cover model. If you've ever tried wearing a plastic Halloween costume all day and ended up drenched in sweat, you're already halfway to understanding medieval chivalry. And here's the punchline: the next time you see a Hollywood knight gleaming under perfect sunlight, remember what you're really missing is the clank of loose rivets, the smell of vinegar-polished steel, and maybe just a hint of fried bacon. You've probably been told that the Middle Ages were one long, stinky nightmare, where nobody bathed, soap didn't exist, and everyone reeked like a locker room after gym class. In school, it's painted as if the streets were clogged with sewage. People never touched water, and perfume was their only hope of survival. If that were true, stepping into a medieval town would have been like walking into a wall of smell, so thick it deserved its own heraldic crest. But the myth doesn't quite hold. The truth is, medieval people actually cared quite a lot about cleanliness, maybe not to our standards of lavender candles and 3-in-1 body wash, but far from the dirt-caked caveman we imagine. Soap existed, and not just in a single bar passed around the whole kingdom. It was made from animal fat and lye, often scented with herbs like lavender or rosemary. Public bathhouses were popular in towns, where people gathered not only to soak and scrub but to socialize. Some even had steam rooms, a medieval version of the spa day. Let's prove it. A mainstream historical fact. In 14th century London, there were so many bathhouses that city officials had to regulate them though. To be fair, some doubled as brothels, which complicated the Yelp reviews. A quirky tidbit. Monks at monasteries were actually required by rule to bathe several times a year and, yes, while several times a year sounds laughably low, it was a lot more structured than people think. And historians still argue whether peasants in rural areas bathed regularly in rivers, or whether that was mostly an urban luxury. Some say villagers dunked in streams all summer. Others say they only splashed their faces and called it good. Imagine yourself ducking into a medieval bathhouse, steam rising, buckets sloshing, chatter bouncing off the tiled walls. Someone's scrubbing their arms with rosemary-scented soap, while a kid runs past with more water than seems physically possible in his bucket. It's not unlike a modern gym locker room, though, with a bit more ale and far fewer neon sneakers. Of course, there were still hygiene misses. Toothpaste was crushed herbs and ashes. Deodorant was whatever herbs you could rub under your arms. And hair washing often involved eggs or vinegar. Good luck explaining that to your shampoo aisle. But all of this is a far cry from the everyone smelled like death stereotype. Here's the punchline. If you were dropped into the Middle Ages, sure, the streets might not smell like fresh laundry, but odds are, the people weren't any stinkier than a crowded subway car in July. And at least they had rosemary soap to help. When you picture a medieval peasant's dinner, you probably imagine a sad wooden bowl filled with beige slop, something between oatmeal and despair. The myth says peasants lived on nothing but watery gruel, spooning it gloomily while dreaming of turkeys the size of wagons roasting in noblemen's halls. It makes for a good, rich versus poor contrast, but in reality, medieval diets were far more colorful and a lot more filling than most school lessons admit. Let's set the table. Bread was the anchor of nearly every meal, baked in communal ovens that smoked out entire villages on bread baking day. But alongside it came beans, peas, onions, turnips, leeks, garlic, and cabbages. People brewed and drank ale so often that even children sipped small beer a week. Low alcohol, drink safer than river water. And while it wasn't turkey legs every night, meat did sneak onto the table more often than you'd guess. From bacon fat to dried fish and the occasional chicken, you'd be surprised how often pork found its way into stews. since pigs were basically medieval garbage disposals, sheep, easy to raise, and happy to eat anything. For the mainstream fact, archaeological digs of village trash pits show bones from cattle, sheep, and pigs mixed right in with vegetable scraps, suggesting that even peasants had access to meat, especially during festivals. A quirky tidbit. There's evidence of medieval fast food street vendors selling hot pies filled with minced meat or fish to passersby, and historians still argue whether peasants were perpetually undernourished or if the average rural diet, with its grains and seasonal vegetables, was actually healthier than what many 19th century factory workers ate. Close your eyes. You're crouched at a trestle table in a smoky hall. A loaf of brown rye bread sits in front of you, the crust crackling as you tear it. There's a bowl of pottage bubbling an ever-changing stew, where today's beans mix with yesterday's scraps and tomorrow's leftovers. Someone hands you a cup of frothy ale, not icy cold, but warm and earthy. A neighbor dips a hunk of bread right into the pot, and no one bats an eye. Sure, there's no mac and cheese, but there's comfort here, and plenty of flavor if you're used to garlic and herbs. The myth of peasants starving on sludge persists because it's simple and dramatic. But the truth is, the medieval table was more like rustic farm-to-table dining than eternal misery. Not luxurious, no, but hearty and sustaining. And here's the punchline. The next time you complain about your lunch being just leftovers, remember medieval folks basically lived on leftovers, and they managed to turn it into culture. Who knows, maybe your microwaved casserole is just a modern form of pottage. You've probably seen castles in movies looking like cozy, glowing palaces, tapestries fluttering, fires crackling, goblets clinking in perfectly lit halls. The myth goes like this. Castles were giant mansions, warm and inviting, designed for luxury and comfort. A sort of medieval five-star hotel, if you like, where knights lounged in feather beds and nobles dined on roasted swan by candlelight. But let's be honest, if you actually had to spend a night in one, you'd probably beg for a holiday inn. The truth, castles were military fortresses first, homes second, and comfort a very distant third. Their massive stone walls didn't hold in heat, they bled it out. Imagine standing in your living room in January, with no insulation, the windows open, and a wind tunnel running through. That's a medieval castle. Drafts whipped under the doors, fireplaces smoked more than they warmed, and tapestries were basically the medieval version of shoving an extra blanket against a cold wall. Let's drop in the facts. A mainstream detail. Records from English royal accounts show entire forests of firewood consumed each winter just to keep great halls tolerably warm. In Westminster Palace, officials logged staggering amounts of oak burned through the season yet. Visitors still complained of icy chambers. A quirky tidbit. Archaeologists have found layers of rodent droppings in castle floors, proof that mice and rats shared the same luxury accommodations as the nobles. And historians still argue whether the noise of a crowded castle guards shouting, animals stabled inside, children playing, dogs barking made them unbearable living spaces, or whether residents just tuned it all out like background hum. Close your eyes and step inside a medieval great hall. You enter through a huge wooden door, and the cold air nips your face immediately. The fire blazes in a central hearth, but unless you're standing right next to it, you may as well be outside. The walls drip with condensation in winter, and drafts whistle through arrow slits. Above you, smoke curls up toward the rafters, blackening the beams and stinging your eyes. Somewhere, a guard clanks past in armor, muttering about his shift, while in the corner, a scullery maid chases a goose that got loose from the kitchen. Romantic, maybe in theory. In reality, it's like trying to host Thanksgiving dinner in a bus station. And let's not forget the smells. Castles were alive with food, cooking, people sweating, animals snorting, and chamber pots being carried down winding staircases. Some castles had garderobes, basically vertical shafts that dumped waste outside into cesspits or moats. Convenient, yes. Smelly, you bet. If you're picturing a king enjoying roasted venison, you also need to picture him doing so with a faint whiff of sewage drifting in. Now, the funny part is, nobles did decorate. Rich tapestries, painted walls, colorful tiles, carved furniture, anything to make the place feel like home. But even then, the cold stone one, guests often kept their cloaks on at dinner. Servants carried hot coals in little pans to warm the king's feet. Imagine hosting a dinner party and apologizing to your guests by saying, "Don't worry, just bring your own blanket, it's drafty tonight." For a light joke, think of a castle, not as a cozy palace, but as the world's most ambitious camping trip. You're sheltered, technically, but you're also constantly cold, surrounded by animals, and hoping your food doesn't taste of smoke, and that mattress stuffed with straw. It's the medieval version of a lumpy futon you regret buying on sale. Here's the punchline. Castles impress us today because they look magnificent from the outside. But step inside, and you'd be longing for a snug cottage with a chimney and a wool blanket. Comfort wasn't the point, defense was. So next time you picture yourself as a lord in a castle, remember, you're not reclining in a warm palace. You're basically squatting in the world's fanciest stone refrigerator. If you grew up with fairy tales and Halloween stories, you probably imagine the medieval world crawling with witch trials, torches blazing, angry mobs, and women tied to stakes, while villagers chanted ominously. The myth is that the Middle Ages were one giant witch hunt, where anyone with a mole, a cat, or a slightly bad attitude ended up accused of devilry. Teachers might even hint that every odd-looking villager was at risk of being called a witch. It's chilling imagery, but it's not quite right. The truth is, widespread witch trials weren't really a medieval phenomenon at all. They belong more to the early modern period, think 1500s and 1600s. When paranoia and legal systems collided to create the infamous witch hunts in Europe and colonial America. During much of the Middle Ages, accusations of witchcraft did occur, but they were fewer, often tangled with village quarrels or superstitions, and very rarely escalated to the mass hysteria we picture. In fact, medieval church authorities were sometimes surprisingly skeptical of witchcraft claims, insisting that most so-called witches were deluded or harmless. Now for the proof, a mainstream historical fact. In 906, church law actually condemned the belief that witches could fly or meet with demons, declaring such ideas heretical themselves. Imagine that denying witches' powers was the official line. A quirky tidbit. Some court records show medieval villagers accusing neighbors of stealing milk from cows by whispering spells. Magical dairy theft was apparently a big concern, and historians still argue Whether women accused of sorcery were genuinely feared for supposed powers, or whether the accusations were often just convenient excuses to settle grudges or disputes over property. Picture yourself walking into a medieval village after sunset. A chill creeps in, and shadows stretch across crooked cottages. You hear gossip someone's cow won't give milk, and an old widow down the lane is being whispered about. But instead of rushing to burn her, the community might just scold her, call in a priest for prayers, or shrug it off as bad luck. More often, the drama fizzled out long before anyone pulled out torches. That's not to say it was all cozy. Fear of magic did exist. Charms, curses, and protective amulets were common. People pinned herbs above doorways or tied charms to their animals' necks to ward off evil. A shepherd might even blame a rival for bewitching his sheep if they got sick. It was less about sinister witches brewing cauldrons and more about neighbors nervously wondering why their bread burned or their goat went missing. Of course, witchcraft eventually took on darker tones. By the late 1400s, treatises like the infamous Malleus Maleficarum fanned fears of diabolical witches. But that's the cusp of the Renaissance, not the heart of the Middle Ages. During the medieval centuries, a woman with a black cat was more likely to be thought of as eccentric than as a sorceress awaiting trial. Now, here's where it gets funny. Imagine accusing someone today of witchcraft because your Wi-Fi is slow or your latte tastes burnt. That's not far off from some of the medieval complaints. She glared at me, and now my butter won't churn. The line between coincidence and conspiracy was often a very thin, dairy-covered one. So here's the punchline. When you think of witch trials, don't picture the Middle Ages, picture what came after. For most medieval folks, witches weren't an epidemic of evil, just a handful of odd neighbors, superstitions, and the occasional suspiciously sour milk. So the next time your bread doesn't rise, don't blame a witch, blame your yeast, unless, of course, your neighbor really is cackling at you from her herb garden. If you've ever heard someone sum up medieval medicine, you probably got the cartoon version. Leeches bleeding and clueless doctors waving herbs around while chanting. The myth says that if you got sick in the Middle Ages, your best hope was a leech, your second best was a priest, and your third best was an early grave. In other words, people believe medicine was nothing but superstition wrapped in misery. The truth, though, is far more complicated and, surprisingly, much more advanced. In some areas, yes, leeches were used, but so were surgeries, ointments, and herbal treatments that sometimes worked better than you'd expect. Medieval medicine combined practical remedies with spiritual belief, creating a system that was both bizarre and occasionally brilliant. For proof, let's start with the mainstream fact. Medical manuscripts from monasteries record recipes for everything from stomach aches to headaches. Remedies included honey as an antiseptic and garlic for infections, both of which modern science agrees have antibacterial properties. Quirky tidbit: a 10th century English text known as Bald's Leech Book describes a potion for eye infections that involved onion, garlic, wine, and cow bile brewed in a brass vessel. Tested in modern labs, this strange cow bile cocktail actually killed antibiotic-resistant bacteria, and historians still argue whether medieval surgeons' use of trepanning, cutting holes into skulls to relieve pressure, was effective treatment or reckless guesswork. Now, imagine yourself walking into a medieval infirmary. Sunlight filters through narrow windows, and the air smells of rosemary and sage. A monk stirs a pot of boiling herbs, while a scribe copies recipes into a thick manuscript. In the corner, a patient lies with bandages wrapped in honey-soaked cloth, while another swallows a concoction of mint and vinegar to calm his stomach. And yes, someone else is nervously eyeing a jar of wriggling leeches. It's equal parts pharmacy, kitchen, and experiment lab. Of course, some cures make you wince. Powdered emeralds for stomach pain. Toasted hedgehog for baldness. And let's not forget the crocodile dung sunscreen I mentioned earlier, though to be fair, that one comes from ancient Egypt, not Europe. Still, medieval people sometimes borrowed those odd ideas, convinced nature's strangest ingredients might heal. Joke number 1. Imagine a medieval doctor today recommending a dash of emerald powder with your breakfast smoothie. Instagram. Wellness influencers would have a field day. But here's the thing. Medicine wasn't just guesswork. Surgeons stitched wounds with surprising skill, and battlefield manuals described how to treat arrow injuries. Physicians diagnosed illness by examining urine's color, smell, and even taste. Yes, they tasted it. Joke number 2. Now imagine your doctor saying, "Please hand me that sample eel, take a sip." Unpleasant, yes, but surprisingly accurate in detecting diabetes. Even the dreaded Black Death brought strange medical attempts. People burned herbs in the streets, wore beak-shaped masks filled with spices, and tried bloodletting in desperation. Many cures failed, but the effort itself shows a society trying hard to understand disease. And historians note that some methods, like quarantining ships for 40 days, 40 giorni, actually worked, giving us the very word quarantine. Humor aside, medieval medicine was a patchwork of wisdom, tradition, and superstition. Some treatments make us laugh today, but others reveal early glimmers of modern science. And here's joke number 3. Next time you complain about waiting 20 minutes for a doctor, remember a medieval patient might wait 20 days just to find out if his neighbor's hedgehog soup was working. Here's the punchline. Medicine in the Middle Ages wasn't just leeches and doom. It was a messy, creative struggle against illness, sometimes wrong, sometimes right, and often surprisingly close to ideas we still use today. So next time someone says medieval medicine was all nonsense, remind them you'd still rather have honey on a wound than no treatment at all. Asterisk, when you picture a knight in full plate armor, maybe you imagine him as a clumsy tin can falling over like a tipped cow, rolling helplessly on the ground, needing 3 squires and a crane just to stand up. The myth goes that medieval armor was so heavy knights could barely move, let alone fight. It's a fun cartoon image, but if knights had really been that immobile, battlefields would have looked like giant yard sales of toppled metal. The truth, plate armor, while heavy, was incredibly well designed for movement. A full suit usually weighed between 45 and 60 pounds, roughly the weight of modern military gear. And thanks to clever engineering, the weight was distributed across the body, not dragging on the shoulders. Knights could run, jump, climb, and yes, even mount horses without a winch system. Contemporary accounts even describe armored men vaulting onto their saddles or cartwheeling in tournaments just to prove their agility. Imagine a modern soldier running obstacle courses in body armor that's closer to reality than the tin can tumbleweed stereotype. For proof, here's your mainstream fact. Tests with authentic replicas in the royal armories show knights could sprint short distances, climb ladders, and swing weapons effectively. A quirky tidbit. A 15th century German manuscript describes knights doing acrobatics in full plate to train balance and stamina. Yes, medieval CrossFit was a thing, and historians still argue whether armor fatigue was more of a limiting factor than mobility itself. Was it the heat, dehydration, or sheer exhaustion that slowed knights down, not the design? Now, let's paint the scene. You strap into your armor, plates clicking together like puzzle pieces. The visor lowers, your breath echoing in the metal shell. You march into the lists, and instead of waddling, you break into a jog, sword in hand. Your opponent charges, and the clash rings like a blacksmith's shop. Sparks fly, sweat drips, but you're not stuck. You're sprinting, crouching, rolling, your armor flexing with your body like medieval sportswear. That's not to say it was all smooth. Heat was brutal. Knights could bake inside their suits, losing pounds of sweat in a single fight. And yes, falling into deep mud could spell disaster, since armor wasn't buoyant. Joke 1. Imagine sinking like a medieval submarine while your friends shout, "Grab the lance, not the bubbles." But for the most part, armor was functional and surprisingly nimble. Here's joke 2. People today think armor was like wearing a refrigerator. But have you ever tried carrying groceries up 3 flights of stairs? Congratulations, you've just simulated medieval knight training. And joke 3. When kids in school say knights had to be winched onto horses, remember, if true, jousting. Tournaments would have looked like a medieval carnival ride. Step right up, watch Sir Geoffrey dangle from a crane. The truth is, knights trained daily to fight in their gear. It was their second skin, as natural to them as sneakers are. To us, they drilled, sparred, and conditioned themselves to move with steel on every limb. Watching a knight in armor wasn't like watching a robot. It was more like watching an athlete in padded gear. So here's the punchline. Armor didn't make knights into statues, it made them into medieval tanks. They weren't clumsy. They were agile, trained, and terrifying in motion. The myth, immobile knights, survives because it's funny. But the reality is far more impressive. Men turning themselves into walking fortresses that could still run, fight, and yes, even pull off a cartwheel when the crowd demanded it. You've probably heard the cliché that no one could read in the Middle Ages. The myth paints an entire 1,000-year stretch of people wandering around, unable to decipher a single letter, waiting desperately for the Renaissance to hand them glasses and a dictionary. Teachers sometimes summarize it as, monks read, kings signed things with an X, and everyone else stared at their sheep. It makes the period sound like one long, illiterate blur, but the truth is far more nuanced and a lot more interesting. Literacy wasn't universal, of course, but it was hardly non-existent. Priests and monks studied Latin texts. Merchants and tradesmen needed enough literacy for contracts, tally marks, and correspondence. Noble women were often taught to read religious texts, and in some courts, women became notable patrons of literature. Even in villages, basic reading at least enough to recognize prayers or familiar symbols was more common than the total darkness myth suggests. Think of it less as everyone illiterate and more as literacy in layers, spreading differently across classes and regions. Now, for the proof. Mainstream fact. By the 13th century, universities were springing up across Europe, Bologna, Paris, Oxford, creating a whole new class of educated scholars and professionals. A quirky tidbit. Archaeologists have uncovered wax tablets used by medieval schoolchildren with doodles of horses, names, and sometimes crude jokes scribbled alongside their Latin practice. Apparently, doodling during class is a timeless tradition, and historians still argue whether literacy rates were higher in towns than in rural villages, with some scholars suggesting urban centers had surprisingly wide access to reading through guild schools and parish instruction. Picture yourself in a medieval scriptorium. Candles flicker. Monks bend over vellum pages, carefully scratching letters with quills. The sound is soft but steady, like a room full of scratching mice. Outside, a merchant leans over his ledger, calculating profits with marks and notes in the margins. In a nearby manor, a noblewoman sits by a fire, reading aloud a psalter to her children. Even in a small village, the priest teaches a handful of children their letters, while others memorize prayers by rote. It's not universal, but it's not absent either. It's a patchwork quilt of knowledge stitched across society. Of course, there were still plenty of limits. Books were expensive, hand-copied and bound in leather, sometimes chained to lecterns to keep them safe. Owning a book was like owning a car today, a major investment. And languages posed barriers too. Latin was the main written language, but vernacular writing grew steadily, meaning people could eventually read in French, English, or German. Joke 1. Imagine your high school complaining about having to read Shakespeare. Medieval kids were stuck with Latin conjugations. And here's another light jab. People often say medieval folks were completely uneducated. But remember, many modern adults still can't program their microwave clock, so maybe we should cut them some slack. Joke 2. And joke 3. If monks doodling in manuscripts is any sign, then yes, even your medieval textbook had graffiti little knights, fighting snails, rabbits with swords, and cats making messes in the margins. The human instinct to draw weird cartoons in the middle of homework is apparently eternal. What literacy did mean, though, was power. Being able to read gave clergy, merchants, and nobles a huge advantage. Contracts, records, prayers, and law codes all relied on written words. Slowly but surely, literacy spread, not enough to erase the myth entirely, but enough to make the Middle Ages a period of learning in motion, not a frozen swamp of ignorance. So here's the punchline. The idea that no one read in medieval times is about as accurate as saying no one uses the internet unless they're a programmer. Some couldn't, sure, but many could, and those who did shaped their world with it. The next time you hear that myth, remember, medieval literacy wasn't absent. It was uneven like Wi-Fi in a stone castle. Sometimes strong, sometimes weak, but always there. Asterisk, Section 8. You've probably heard the cliché that no one could read in the Middle Ages. The myth paints an entire 1,000-year stretch of people wandering around, unable to decipher a single letter, waiting desperately for the Renaissance to hand them glasses and a dictionary. Teachers sometimes summarize it as monks read, kings signed things with an X, and everyone else stared at their sheep. It makes the period sound like one long, illiterate blur, but the truth is far more nuanced and a lot more interesting. Literacy wasn't universal, of course, but it was hardly non-existent. Priests and monks studied Latin texts. Merchants and tradesmen needed enough literacy for contracts, tally marks, and correspondence. Noblewomen were often taught to read religious texts, and in some courts, women became notable patrons of literature. Even in villages, basic reading at least enough to recognize prayers or familiar symbols was more common than the total darkness myth suggests. Think of it less as everyone illiterate and more as literacy in layers, spreading differently across classes and regions. Now, for the proof. Mainstream fact. By the 13th century, universities were springing up across Europe, Bologna, Paris, Oxford, creating a whole new class of educated scholars and professionals. A quirky tidbit. Archaeologists have uncovered wax tablets used by medieval schoolchildren with doodles of horses, names, and sometimes crude jokes scribbled alongside their Latin practice. Apparently, doodling during class is a timeless tradition, and historians still argue whether literacy rates were higher in towns than in rural villages, with some scholars suggesting urban centers had surprisingly wide access to reading through guild schools and parish instruction. Picture yourself in a medieval scriptorium. Candles flicker. Monks bend over vellum pages, carefully scratching letters with quills. The sound is soft but steady, like a room full of scratching mice. Outside, a merchant leans over his ledger, calculating profits with marks and notes in the margins. In a nearby manor, a noblewoman sits by a fire, reading aloud a psalter to her children. Even in a small village, the priest teaches a handful of children their letters, while others memorize prayers by rote. It's not universal, but it's not absent. Either it's a patchwork quilt of knowledge stitched across society. Of course, there were still plenty of limits. Books were expensive, hand-copied and bound in leather, sometimes chained to lecterns to keep them safe. Owning a book was like owning a car today, a major investment. And languages posed barriers. Latin was the main written language, but vernacular writing grew steadily, meaning people could eventually read in French, English, or German. Joke 1. Imagine your high school complaining about having to read Shakespeare. Medieval kids were stuck with Latin conjugations. And here's another light jab. People often say medieval folks were completely uneducated. But remember, many modern adults still can't program their microwave clock, so maybe we should cut them some slack. Joke 2. And joke 3. If monks doodling in manuscripts is any sign, then yes, even your medieval textbook had graffiti little knights, fighting snails, rabbits with swords, and cats making messes in the margins. The human instinct to draw weird cartoons in the middle of homework is apparently eternal. What literacy did mean, though, was power. Being able to read gave clergy, merchants, and nobles a huge advantage. Contracts, records, prayers, and law codes all relied on written words. Slowly but surely, literacy spread, not enough to erase the myth entirely, but enough to make the Middle Ages a period of learning in motion, not a frozen swamp of ignorance. So here's the punchline. The idea that no one read in medieval times is about as accurate as saying no one uses the internet unless they're a programmer. Some couldn't, sure, but many could, and those who did shaped their world with it. The next time you hear that myth, remember, medieval literacy wasn't absent. It was uneven like Wi-Fi in a stone castle. Sometimes strong, sometimes weak, but always there. If you've ever sat through a history class, you might have heard the old chestnut. Medieval people thought the earth was flat. The myth insists that everyone in the Middle Ages wandered around in terror of falling off the edge of the world, staring suspiciously at the horizon as if ships might topple into the cosmic abyss like toys slipping off a bathtub. It's a neat way of making the past look ignorant, but here's the quiet twist to most. Nobody in the Middle Ages actually believed that. The truth is that educated Europeans overwhelmingly understood the earth was a sphere. The idea came down from the ancient Greeks and Romans, preserved by early Christian scholars, Islamic philosophers, and medieval universities. People argued over the size of the earth, or how it fit into God's creation, but the roundness itself, that was pretty well accepted. Sailors, merchants, and scholars alike recognized that curved horizons, disappearing ships, and lunar eclipses made sense on a round globe. So the image of knights scoffing at Columbus for suggesting a spherical earth, that's Hollywood invention, not history. Proof time. A mainstream fact. As early as the 6th century, the scholar Isidore of Seville described the earth as orb-shaped. By the 13th century, Thomas Aquinas was calmly discussing the globe in his Summa Theologica, a quirky tidbit. In cathedral schools, students sometimes played with spheres, literal globes made of wood or metal as teaching tools. Imagine geometry, homework with props shaped like soccer balls. And historians still argue whether average peasants, those without access to books, thought much about the earth's shape at all. Or did they not think about it one way or another, being too busy with goats and taxes? Picture yourself walking into a medieval university lecture. A professor in a long robe points at a wooden globe, tracing routes with a stick, while students scribble notes on wax tablets. Outside, sailors at the docks watch ships vanish hull first over the horizon, muttering, "Yep, she'll be back in a few weeks for the wind's fair." To them, roundness wasn't a philosophical puzzle. It was a daily observation. That's not to say there weren't colorful theories. Joke 1. Somewhere in the Middle Ages, a kid probably asked if those folks wore shoes on their heads. Others wondered if oceans covered the globe entirely, or if strange lands lay hidden. But the idea of falling off the edge of a flat disk, that myth was largely invented later in the 19th century as a way to mock the so-called Dark Ages. And here's where it gets funny. Imagine your teacher insisting medieval people thought the earth was flat, while in reality, monks were doodling little round globes in manuscripts centuries earlier. Joke 2. If anything, they'd be shocked at how many modern people fall for flat earth theories on the internet. And joke 3. The medieval traveler would probably laugh, saying, "Why to still argue about this? We've moved on to weather. Dragons live in India." So here's the punchline. The Middle Ages weren't a flat earth world of ignorance. They were a round earth world of curiosity, debate, and exploration. The real edge people worried about wasn't the planet's limit, was the edge of the map, where here be monsters lived. Asterisk when you think of a castle dungeon. Maybe you picture rows of rusty iron bars, chains rattling on the walls, and poor souls moaning in the dark for decades. Movies love the idea of dungeons as cramped subterranean torture chambers, always crowded, always dripping water dramatically. The myth suggests that every castle kept its enemies locked up in the basement, forever, like a medieval Alcatraz. But the reality, most dungeons weren't even used the way you'd expect. In some castles, they were designed to defend territory and house lords, not hold long-term inmates. If you were unlucky enough to be imprisoned in one, it was usually temporary while waiting for ransom, trial, or political negotiation. Long-term prisons were rare because feeding and guarding prisoners cost too much. More often, punishment took the form of fines, public humiliation, or swift execution. The dungeon full of skeletons, we imagine. That's a legend inflated centuries later, helped along by Gothic novels and spooky tourist tales. Here's the proof. A mainstream fact: the Tower of London, often romanticized as a medieval prison, was originally a fortress and royal residence. Only gradually did it become a holding place for political prisoners, and even then, most were treated better than peasants outside its walls. A quirky tidbit: some so-called oubliettes, tiny underground cells, whose name means to forget, may have been storage pits or cisterns misidentified later, and historians still argue whether grisly torture chambers were common features of castles, or whether later storytellers exaggerated their use to create a mood of horror. Picture stepping into a castle dungeon. Instead of endless rows of barred cells, you find one or two gloomy rooms, maybe a pit accessible only by ladder, maybe just a corner chamber with heavy doors. The walls are damp, the air stale, but it's not a maze of prisoners groaning in chains. It's a temporary lockup, sometimes with surprisingly comfortable conditions for nobles, sipping wine in his cell, while peasants outside chewed hard bread and onions. That's not to say conditions were pleasant. Prisoners could suffer from cold, hunger, and neglect. Some were chained to walls or locked in small pits. And of course, torture did happen: stretching, burning, and pressing, but usually in rare political cases rather than daily routine. Joke 1. If every castle had constant torture happening, medieval Europe would have sounded like a permanent heavy metal concert. Now, here's a lighter view. Public punishment was often favored over hidden dungeons. Gossiping too much. Joke 2. That's basically the medieval version of someone forcing you to post an embarrassing status update. And joke 3. Tourists today sometimes pay to tours authentic medieval dungeons, but many of these were renovated in the 18th or 19th centuries to look scarier than they originally were. In other words, you're admiring a Victorian idea of medieval horror set dressing, not truth. So here's the punchline. Most castles weren't buzzing with permanent jail cells. Dungeons were usually small, rarely used, and often misunderstood. If you had the misfortune of ending up in one, it was probably brief, and if you were noble, maybe even cushy. So next time you imagine moaning skeletons in a castle pit, remember, medieval punishment was more likely to be a fine, a shaming, or a very public slap on the wrist. The eternal dungeon belongs more to ghost stories than to the gritty, day-to-day Middle Ages. When you think of a castle dungeon, maybe you picture rows of rusty iron bars, chains rattling on the walls, and poor souls moaning in the dark for decades. Movies love the idea of dungeons as cramped subterranean torture chambers, always crowded, always dripping water dramatically. The myth suggests that every castle kept its enemies locked up in the basement forever, like a medieval Alcatraz. But the reality? Most dungeons weren't even used the way you'd expect in some castles. They barely existed at all. The truth is, castles were fortresses, not prisons. They were designed to defend territory and house lords, not hold long-term inmates. If you were unlucky enough to be imprisoned in one, it was usually temporary while waiting for ransom, trial, or political negotiation. Long-term prisons were rare because feeding and guarding prisoners cost too much. More often, punishment took the form of fines, public humiliation, or swift execution. The dungeon full of skeletons we imagine. That's a legend inflated centuries later, helped along by Gothic novels and spooky tourist tales. Here's the proof, a mainstream fact. The Tower of London, often romanticized as a medieval prison, was originally a fortress and royal residence. Only gradually did it become a holding place for political prisoners, and even then, most were treated better than peasants outside its walls. A quirky tidbit: some so-called oubliettes, tiny underground cells, whose name means to forget, may have been storage pits or cisterns, misidentified later, and historians still argue whether grisly torture chambers were common features of castles, or whether later storytellers exaggerated their use to create a mood of horror. Picture stepping into a castle dungeon. Instead of endless rows of barred cells, you find one or two gloomy rooms, maybe a pit accessible only by ladder, maybe just a corner chamber with heavy doors. The walls are damp, the air stale, but it's not a maze of prisoners groaning in chains. It's a temporary lockup, sometimes with surprisingly comfortable conditions for nobles. One captured knight might dine decently while waiting for ransom, sipping wine in his cell, while peasants outside chewed hard bread and onions. That's not to say conditions were pleasant. Prisoners could suffer from cold, hunger, and neglect. Some were chained to walls or locked in small pits. And of course, torture did happen: stretching, burning, and pressing, but usually in rare political cases rather than daily routine. Joke 1. If every castle had constant torture happening, medieval Europe would have sounded like a permanent heavy metal concert. Now, here's a lighter view. Public punishment was often favored over hidden dungeons. Stocks in the town square, pillories, or being forced to wear ridiculous shame masks were common. Imagine being punished by walking through the streets wearing a giant iron pig snout for gossiping too much. Joke 2. That's basically the medieval version of someone forcing you to post an embarrassing status update. And joke 3. Tourists today sometimes pay to tour authentic medieval dungeons, but many of these were renovated in the 18th or 19th centuries to look scarier than they originally were. In other words, you're admiring a Victorian idea of medieval horror set dressing, not truth. So, here's the punchline. Most castles weren't buzzing with permanent jail cells. Dungeons were usually small, rarely used, and often misunderstood. If you had the misfortune of ending up in one, it was probably brief, and, if you were noble, maybe even cushy. So, next time you imagine moaning skeletons in a castle pit, remember, medieval punishment was more likely to be a fine, a shaming, or a very public slap on the wrist. The eternal dungeon belongs more to ghost stories than to the gritty, day-to-day Middle Ages. The myth says medieval women were powerless, silent figures in smoky kitchens, hidden in shadows, never owning property, never speaking in courts, never commanding anything but a soup pot. It's a familiar story. Men ruled, women obeyed, and while it's partly rooted in truth, it skips over some startling exceptions that change the picture. If you look closer, you find medieval women stepping out of those shadows, running estates, managing businesses, writing books, even leading armies. Let's flip it. Medieval law did impose limits. Inheritance often favored men, and women's roles were shaped by marriage and family. But within that frame, women carved spaces of power. Noblewomen could control vast estates while their husbands were away, at war, hiring stewards, negotiating with tenants, and defending property in court. Urban women ran shops, brewed ale, and joined guilds. Some became wealthy widows who wielded more freedom than many men and queens. They weren't always quiet consorts. Eleanor of Aquitaine, for example, led troops during the Second Crusade and played politics so fiercely that even kings were nervous. Now for the proof, a mainstream fact. Property records in England and France show widows legally managing landholdings, collecting rents, and suing tenants who failed to pay. A quirky tidbit. In Germany, the alewives were women who dominated beer brewing for centuries before men slowly pushed them out of the trade. And historians still argue whether Joan of Arc was an extraordinary anomaly or one of several women who slipped into military roles when crises demanded it. Close your eyes and step into a medieval market. Women's voices rise above the clamor, haggling over prices, weighing cloth, or shouting that their bread is fresher than yesterday's batch. In a castle hall, a lady of the manor holds a heavy seal, stamping official documents while scribes bow respectfully. And in a battlefield tent, a young woman in armor rallies soldiers, her banner fluttering in the dawn light. These aren't side characters, they're central players in their communities. Of course, life wasn't easy. Many women faced severe restrictions, from arranged marriages to legal guardianship under fathers or husbands, violence, social expectations, and religious teachings often tried to box them in. But cracks in the system allowed moments of authority. Joke 1. Imagine a medieval lord away on crusade, thinking he's in charge while back home his wife has already rented out his fields, collected rents, and upgraded the kitchen. And joke 2. Those ale brewing women. Some added herbs to their beer, giving it strange colors or foamy textures. Customers sometimes accused them of witchcraft. Basically, the medieval version of complaining your craft beer is too experimental. Joke 3. If you think today's workplace politics are complicated, picture a noblewoman managing 50 servants, 3 squabbling tenants, and 1 moody goose that refuses to leave the courtyard, all while making sure the estate's taxes are paid to the king, who's powerless there. So here's the punchline. Women in the Middle Ages weren't just silent figures, they were managers, makers, and sometimes warriors. Power wasn't equal, but it was there, threaded through the everyday and the extraordinary. Next time someone says women had no role in history, remember Eleanor, Joan, and the thousands of unnamed women who ran markets, brewed beer, and kept estates alive. Without them, the medieval world would have collapsed faster than a straw roof in a rainstorm. You've probably heard the phrase, the Dark Ages, a label that makes it sound like 1,000 years of flickering candles, ignorance, and people stumbling around, waiting for the Renaissance to turn the lights back on. The myth insists that nothing happened between Rome and the Renaissance except misery, mud, and moth-eaten manuscripts. It's a dramatic image, but hopelessly unfair. The truth is, the Middle Ages were bursting with creativity, learning, and innovation. Cathedrals rose higher than any building before them, their stained glass windows washing entire congregations in rainbows of light. Universities sprouted across Europe, formalizing education for thousands of students. Trade routes carried spices, silks, and knowledge between continents. Far from dark, the era was lit sometimes literally with invention, art, and scholarship. Here's the proof. Mainstream fact. By the 12th century, Paris, Oxford, and Bologna had universities teaching medicine, law, and philosophy, places where students argued Aristotle, translated Arabic texts, and sometimes staged noisy protests that sound suspiciously modern. Quirky tidbit. Medieval engineers built water clocks, mechanical calendars, and even little robotic figures powered by gears and water pressure, the ancestors of cuckoo clocks and toys. And historians still argue whether the label Dark Ages was invented by Renaissance humanists to make themselves look smarter, or by Enlightenment thinkers who wanted to sneer at the past. Picture yourself stepping into Chartres Cathedral on a sunny day. Light spills through vast rose windows, scattering colors across stone pillars as choirs chant in Latin or walk into a bustling medieval fair. Merchants shouting over bolts of cloth, minstrels playing lutes, apprentices running with armfuls of goods. The air is alive with movement, music, and trade, not darkness. Even science ticked along. Physicians studied texts from the Islamic world. Astronomers tracked the stars, and mathematicians puzzled over geometry problems. Of course, the period had its hardships. Plague, wars, and famines struck hard, but darkness wasn't the default state of every village or city. Life had rhythm, festivals, innovations, and new ideas emerging constantly. Joke 1. If the Middle Ages were so dark, how did they manage to invent stained glass brighter than half the neon signs in Las Vegas? And joke 2. Students in medieval universities sometimes rioted over beer prices in town. If that sounds ridiculous, remember students today still protest over cafeteria food. Apparently, academia's priorities haven't changed much. Joke 3. Calling the Middle Ages dark is like calling your phone broken just because it doesn't have the latest update. Sure, there were limits, but the system worked and people used it to create wonders. So, here's the punchline. The Middle Ages weren't dark, they were dazzling in their own ways. They gave us soaring cathedrals, new systems of learning, and inventions that still echo in our lives. The real darkness isn't in history itself. It's in the myths we keep repeating about it. If you've heard medieval superstition stories, you might think cats were hated across the board, burned as witches, familiars, chased from villages, and treated as omens of evil. The myth paints the Middle Ages as a feline nightmare, with every black cat in danger of meeting a torch-wielding mob. It's dramatic, sure, but not quite the full truth. The reality is mixed. Yes, cats were sometimes linked to witches and the devil in late medieval superstition. But for much of the period, they were welcomed as useful pest controllers and even cherished as pets. Monks kept them in monasteries to guard grain from mice. Noble households fed and named them. And despite later demonization, cats padded comfortably through medieval streets, barns, and kitchens, often curled up by the hearth. Proof time. Mainstream fact. Records from medieval manuscripts and illuminations show cats depicted lounging beside their human companions, sometimes even playing with yarn or pestering scribes by pawing at parchment. A quirky tidbit: there's a surviving medieval cat paw print stamped right across a 15th century manuscript, proof that cats were wandering libraries long before TikTok made it cute. And historians still argue whether the church-led association of cats with witchcraft meaningfully reduced their numbers, or whether that's more legend than reality. Picture yourself inside a medieval scriptorium. The air is thick with candle smoke, parchment crackles, and a monk carefully inks Latin letters. The monk sighs, perhaps curses under his breath, but doesn't kick the cat out. Instead, he keeps writing, paw prints and all. In another scene, a peasant in a cottage smiles as his barn cat chases down a mouse that would have nibbled his grain. Far from demons, cats were allies against vermin. That's not to say there wasn't suspicion. Black cats, especially, could raise eyebrows, and some sermons warned against their association with the devil. By the later Middle Ages, witchcraft fears began sticking to cats like burrs on fur. But it wasn't universal hatred. It was regional, cultural, and often exaggerated later. Joke 1. If cats were really despised, medieval people clearly forgot to tell the hundreds of manuscript artists doodling them into margins, where they appear licking themselves, chasing mice, or even mooning the reader. And joke 2. Imagine villagers trying to ban cats, only to realize their grain stores immediately filled with rats. That's the medieval version of deleting your antivirus software, and then wondering why your computer crashes. Joke 3. Historians sometimes suggest the decline of cats in certain set regions contributed to the rise of plague-carrying rats. If true, that makes medieval cat haters indirectly responsible for the worst pandemic in European history, which means somewhere a smug medieval cat was probably thinking, "Told you so." So here's the punchline. Cats in the Middle Ages weren't universally feared. They were useful, often loved, sometimes mistrusted, but always present. They padded across parchment, prowled in barns, and curled up by firesides. The myth of a world without cats is as false as a blank medieval manuscript. Its missing paw prints, scratches, and a furry friend lurking in the corner. The myth says games and fun were reserved for kings and nobles, chess in gilded halls, jousts in sunny courtyards, and banquets where lords wagered fortunes. Everyone else. The stereotype paints peasants as humorless drudges with no time for play. Sometimes refined were everywhere, cutting across class lines like an unexpected laugh. In a funeral sermon, the truth is that medieval people loved their games. Nobles played chess, backgammon, and dice, while peasants kicked leather balls across fields in chaotic football matches that sometimes turned into small-scale riots. Children had toys, like carved wooden horses or dolls of cloth and wax. Festivals brought dancing, wrestling, and archery contests. And then there were gambling games, where dice rolled in taverns as men argued about luck and ale. If the Middle Ages were joyless, someone forgot to tell the crowds cheering at tournaments or laughing at jugglers in market squares. Proof time, mainstream fact. The game of chess spread into Europe through Islamic Spain around the 10th century, and quickly became a noble pastime, complete with rule variations and moral allegories about kingship. A quirky tidbit. Records from England show entire villages playing a wild form of football that had no field boundaries, basically two teams trying to drag a ball from one end of the parish to the other, often through rivers, houses, and terrified livestock. And historians still argue whether medieval board games were seen purely as entertainment or whether some were teaching tools wrapped in fun. Now, close your eyes and imagine yourself at a medieval fair. A crowd gathers around to wrestlers, their shirts torn, faces red as children squeal nearby with homemade spinning tops. Behind them, a nobleman sits with a carved chessboard, planning his next move with the intensity of a military strategist. In the tavern, dice clatter against wooden tables as laughter rises, ale sloshing into cups. Meanwhile, in a village meadow, peasants chase a ball in a game so rough that it looks more like rugby, with no rules and no referee. Of course, not every game was innocent. The church sometimes frowned on dice and gambling, declaring them temptations of the devil. Kings occasionally banned football for being too violent or for distracting men from practicing archery, which they considered more useful for war. Joke 1. Imagine your boss today banning soccer because it takes time away from Excel spreadsheets. And joke 2. Chess was sometimes considered so morally weighty that bishops warned players not to get too addicted. Picture a medieval priest scolding you for playing just one more game, the same way modern parents worry about too much Fortnite. Joke 3. The rough peasant football games. They sometimes ended with broken bones and lawsuits, which means the phrase friendly match didn't always apply. If you think modern sports fans are rowdy, try chasing a pigskin through a medieval marketplace. Games served more than fun. They bonded communities, reinforced status, and gave people moments of joy amid hard labor. They also left us legacies. Modern chess, dice games, and ball sports trace their roots to these centuries. So here's the punchline. Medieval life wasn't all work and no play. It was full of games that made people laugh, argue, gamble, or tumble into mud. Next time someone says peasants never had fun, just picture them charging down a muddy lane with a ball, while nobles upstairs squabbled over pawns on a chessboard. Different boards, same human love of play. You've probably heard the famous line, in the Middle Ages, people only lived to be 30. The myth goes that life was so short, disease so rampant, and danger so constant that turning 40 made you practically a wizard. Teachers, sometimes, toss out that statistic to show how brutal the medieval world was, leaving the impression that everyone keeled over by their 30th birthday. But like most simple statistics, it hides a much richer and less gloomy truth. The reality is that the average life expectancy was low because of high infant mortality. Many children died in the first few years of life, dragging down the overall numbers. But if you survived childhood, your odds of reaching 50, 60, or even 70 were much better than most people think. Noblemen, peasants, monks, and queens all left records showing lifespans well beyond 30. So rather than imagining medieval villages filled with 29-year-olds preparing for death, picture multi-generational families with grandparents, parents, and children under one smoky thatched roof. Let's prove it. Mainstream fact: records from English manorial rolls in the 13th century show plenty of men and women living into their 60s. A quirky tidbit: an Italian knight named Andrea Lancia wrote poetry in his 70s, poking fun at his own creaky joints, proof that old age humor existed long before Twitter memes. And historians still argue whether diet, lifestyle, or environment was the key factor. Did peasants' physical labor keep them hardy, or did the constant grind wear them down too soon? Imagine yourself in a medieval village. The children run barefoot through muddy lanes, a grandmother sits by the fire carding wool, and a grandfather tells stories of battles long past. A farmer in his 40s bends his back to the plow, while his wife in her 50s kneads bread with practiced strength. Yes, danger lurks, accidents, infections, childbirth complications, but longevity wasn't unthinkable. The churchyard isn't just filled with the young, it holds elders too, some remembered for long lives of labor or leadership, of course. Surviving childhood was the hardest hurdle. A simple fever or infection could turn deadly for the young, which is why baptism often happened quickly after birth. But once grown, adults sometimes thrived. Joke 1. If you met a 60-year-old medieval farmer, he might laugh at the myth, saying, "I've been living past the deadline for 30 years. Joke 2. Nobles liked to complain about aging too. Letters from elderly lords lament thinning hair and aching knees, apparently. The medieval complaint, "My back hurts," is just as timeless as your uncle grumbling at family dinners. Joke 3. Monks often bragged about their longevity, crediting their simple diets of bread, fish, and beer, which means the medieval version of a wellness influencer was a monk saying, "Try my Bredendale cleansive, made it to 72. Longevity also depended on luck and class. Nobles had better food, but also more risks in politics and war. Peasants faced grueling labor but sometimes avoided the stress of court intrigues. Women faced added dangers in childbirth, but many survived to raise large families and grow old among grandchildren. Life was fragile, yes, but it wasn't a short, automatic countdown to 30. So here's the punchline. The myth of medieval life expectancy ignores the full picture. People did live long lives if they made it past the dangerous early years. Next time you hear they only lived to 30, imagine a medieval grandmother chuckling by the fire, smacking that statistic with her walking stick. She's proof that history, like life itself, goes on longer than you think. And now, as we leave behind our journey through myths and truths, it's time to soften the pace. You've wandered through castles, kitchens, markets, and meadows, peering behind the curtain of cliché to find people real, complicated, and often familiar. They laughed at games, polished their armor, worried about their children, and sometimes lived long enough to tell stories by the fire. The world we call medieval wasn't a flat, dark, or joyless age, was a living mosaic of details, small and large, ordinary and extraordinary. Let your mind drift, imagining the glow of candlelight on old stone walls, the quiet rustle of parchment, the scent of bread rising from a village oven. Hear the distant chatter of merchants at a fair, or the slow creak of a drawbridge lowering at dusk. These sounds fade, like dreams dissolving at sunrise, leaving behind only calm and stillness. As your breathing slows, remember the simple truth. People of the past were not so different from us. They worked, played, worried, and loved. Their myths live on because they tell us something about human imagination, but their truths whisper even more, reminding us that history is always more nuanced than the stories we first hear in school. So, let go of the clang of swords and the shuffle of peasants in muddy lanes. Instead, picture a soft, endless horizon under starlight, the world round and vast, carrying you gently into sleep.